Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and we're about to talk about some of the more tricky rules in Arkham Horror the card game, those involving enemy management and movement. When I first started playing this game, I know I had to look up the rules about when and how enemies engage investigators over and over again, so I'm going to walk you through the rules and clear up all the sticking points. Think of it like a mini course in Arkham Horror the card game. Let's start off our discussion with some basic concepts. These are the foundations for everything you'll need to know later on. First off, take an enemy, like this basic ghoul minion. Enemies have two parameters which are very important. One, whether they are engaged, that is, in the threat area of any investigator, or unengaged, that is, not in the threat area of any investigator, instead usually placed at a location. And two, enemies are either ready or exhausted. Exhausted enemies, like any other exhausted card, are rotated 90 degrees to indicate that they are exhausted. All cards ready during step 4.3 of the upkeep phase towards the end of the round. Now, these two states usually go together. Engaged enemies are usually ready, and unengaged enemies are usually exhausted, but this is not necessarily the case. Engaged enemies can be exhausted, such as after they attack an investigator during the enemy phase, and unengaged enemies can be ready, such as when they are at locations with no investigators. It's important to keep these straight because while ready engaged enemies can make attacks of opportunity, neither exhausted engaged enemies nor ready unengaged enemies can. However, it's important to note that a ready unengaged enemy automatically engages an investigator at its location. Which investigator will that be? If there are multiple investigators at its location, the lead investigator chooses who it will engage. This is one of the times in Arkham Horror the card game where you may make a choice that ends up being beneficial. Maybe one investigator has a machete in play. They will be happy to take that ghoul minion into the next round. That said, by default, an enemy drawn from the encounter deck spawns engaged with the investigator who drew it. So, even if there are multiple investigators in the same location, if you draw an enemy, it goes directly into your threat area. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Once you're engaged with an enemy, it is difficult to break engagement. The most common way is evasion. The result of an evade test, or an automatic evasion, is that the enemy disengages from the investigator that is engaged with, and it exhausts. Note that an evade test must be done against an enemy that you are engaged with, but automatic evasions, like the stray cat, can target any enemy, even ones that you are not engaged with. There are also some cards that simply disengage from enemies, like Cat Burglar. These enemies remain ready, and if there are any other investigators at their location, these enemies will automatically engage them. Finally, there are a few cards that move enemies independent of investigators. Using the Go command on Power Word can move the attached enemy out of your threat area and into another location. It is no longer engaged with you, but it is still ready and may engage someone else. Note that the Cower command does nearly the opposite. The enemy exhausts, but does not disengage with whoever it is engaged with. Disengagement of the sort described here is fairly rare. It's easier to remember the usual case. When you move, engaged enemies move with you. That's even the case with a card like Shortcut, theme aside. Enemies can move on their own too. The most common case is when the enemy has the Hunter keyword. During step 3.2 of the enemy phase, each ready, unengaged enemy with the Hunter keyword moves once on the shortest path towards the nearest investigator. Let's check where that is on the round sequence chart. It's right at the beginning of the enemy phase, before all enemies get to attack. So, if an enemy with Hunter moves, and then is ready to engage with an investigator, that enemy will attack that investigator. Let's look at some examples on the board. First, the basic case. A hunting Nightgaunt is one location away from an investigator. During the enemy phase, it will move once into Southside. Because it is ready and unengaged, it engages the investigator there, and then makes its attack. Remember, though, that hunters normally only move one location. Here, if the investigator is at St. Mary's Hospital, 2 locations away from where the hunting Nightgaunt is, it is safe this round. Hunters only move if there is no investigator at their current location. Here, the Nightgaunt isn't going to move to Southside because it is not unengaged. It's already engaged with the investigator at its location, but we'll see later that some hunter enemies may be unengaged by default. Okay, last example. If 2 investigators are equidistant from the hunter enemy, The lead investigator may choose which direction the hunter moves in, so either investigator will get attacked by the night god. That's all the basics. This will cover 80% of what you'll run into with enemies in Arkham Horror. Now let's talk about the exceptions. These are the keywords on enemies to look out for that affect enemy engagement and movement. Prey, prey only, spawn, massive, and aloof. The big one is prey. Prey is only a tiebreaker. Remember the few cases where I talked about how the lead investigator could choose who an enemy would engage or hunt towards? If an enemy has prey, it will target the investigator that best meets its prey instead. But this is only when you would have had a choice. Enemies with prey still can engage and hunt investigators that don't meet its prey. Let's work through a few examples. Okay, the Ghoul Priest I just showed you has prey, highest combat. This means that if all else is equal, it's going to engage or hunt towards the investigator with the highest combat score, including any static boosts in play. So, let's say the Ghoul Priest is at Rivertown, engage with an investigator with 4 combat. That investigator then evades the Ghoul Priest. There's also an investigator here with 3 combat. Who does the Ghoul Priest engage during upkeep when it readies? Well, it has to engage the investigator with 4 combat. You don't get to choose, it must engage its prey. Now, same situation, but let's say during the upkeep phase, the 4 combat investigator is in Southside. This time, the Ghoul Priest will engage the 3 combat investigator, even though it has the lowest combat score. Why? Because ready enemies automatically engage an investigator at its location. Just because its prey is somewhere else doesn't mean the Ghoul Priest would remain unengaged. Next situation. Let's say both investigators are in Southside and the Ghoul Priest is in Rivertown. The Ghoul Priest also has Hunter, so at the beginning of the enemy phase, it will move towards the nearest investigator, which will move it into Southside. There, it has to engage someone, and the tiebreaker here is its prey, the 4 combat investigator. It won't surprise you that if the investigators are at different locations, the Ghoul Priest will still come after the 4 combat investigator. But how about this situation? Now the 4 combat investigator is 2 locations away, while the 3 combat investigator is only 1 location away. Where does the Ghoul Priest go? In this case, the Ghoul Priest will still hunt into the location with the nearest investigator, even though that investigator does not have the highest combat. That last part is admittedly intuitive, since it seems as though prey means it only goes after that investigator. Confusingly, there is a variant of prey called prey only that works exactly like that. Enemies with prey X only do not automatically engage or hunt towards other investigators. Take the graveyard ghouls, for example. If William York evades them for some reason and leaves them behind in a location with another investigator, when the graveyard ghouls readies, it will not automatically engage another investigator at that location. Essentially, they pretend other investigators in the game do not exist at all when it comes to engagement or movement. Strangely, other investigators can attack them without needing to engage them first. Next up is spawn. If an enemy has spawn printed on it, it means it will override the usual spawn rules, which, remember, say that an enemy spawns engaged with the investigator who drew the card. Instead, the enemy will spawn unengaged in an indicated location. If that location is not in play, the enemy is discarded without a replacement. If the location is in play, if there are any investigators at that location, it will engage with its prey if it has any. If not, you get to choose, following all the normal rules that we've already talked about. For example, if 2 investigators are in the cellar, and you draw the Icy Ghoul, it will spawn with either investigator, even though you drew the card. Make sense? Well, it's time for a pop quiz. Let's take an example from Murder at the Excelsior Hotel. Roland and Jenny are at room 225, and William York is at the suite balcony. Both are crime scene locations. Roland has 2 clues, Jenny 3, and York 4. Take a look at the conspicuous staff enemy. It has spawn, nearest crime scene location, and prey, most clues. Here's the question. Roland draws the conspicuous staff from the encounter deck. Who does it engage? Think about it for a second. If you said Jenny, you're correct. Let's think about why. Since Roland drew the card, the spawn instructions say to go to the nearest crime scene location. The nearest one is the one that Roland is in. They will spawn unengaged, but then automatically engage an investigator, the one that best meets its prey, most clues, and that would be Jenny Barnes, even though William York has more clues. Great, you're doing well. Let's finish off our lesson with 2 more keywords. Massive enemies. These enemies are pretty simple. Unlike regular enemies, they are considered to be engaged with all investigators at their location. They don't go into any threat area though, leave them at the location card. There is no timing point for this engagement, so cards like Zoe's Cross cannot trigger. Massive enemies can still be exhausted through all the normal means. When they exhaust, they are not considered to be engaged anymore. One more rule change: massive enemies do not move with engaged investigators, so you're free to either walk out of a location, taking attack of opportunity, or play shortcut without the fear of dragging them with you. Lastly, let's look at aloof enemies. Again, the rule change here is that aloof enemies spawn unengaged and do not automatically engage enemies at their location. When you draw them, place them at your location unengaged. Next, they must be engaged with investigator in order for them to be attacked. You are free to take the engage action to engage them and then take a fight test, but you are also still able to deal damage to aloof enemies that are unengaged in other ways, like using the triggered ability on B-Cop. One wrinkle here is that after you evade an aloof enemy, it will become unengaged once again, so you must re-engage it if you want to attack it. Last comment, the normal hunter rules still apply. The whippoorwill here will not move if there are any investigators at its location, even if the whippoorwill remains unengaged. That's the end of this guide to enemy engagement and movement in Arkham Horror the card game. I completely understand that this is one of the more confusing parts of the game, so please feel free to ask questions in the comments below if you're having doubts. You're bound to help out a fellow investigator with your question. In the meantime, while you're waiting for an answer, please check out more content here on my channel, especially my other rules videos.